Hello, everyone. I'm Howard Friedman. I'm the director of the Jewish Community Library in San Francisco, and I'm so glad to welcome all of you. I want to thank our friends at New Lair House and the JFCS Holocaust Center for their partnership for today's event. And I want to thank the friends of the Jewish Community Library who make everything we do possible, particularly now that the library is independent. I hope you will consider becoming a friend by giving at any level at friendsofthejcl.org. Please note that automated closed captioning can be turned on or off by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen. And we'll all be muted except for our presenters, but people will have the opportunity to ask questions after the presentation. So please put your questions in the chat, and then I'll relay them at the end, time permitting. It is a real pleasure to welcome Rafael Medoff, the author of the new graphic novel style book, Whistleblowers, Four Who Fought to Expose the Holocaust to America, as well as San Francisco author Ruth Landy, whose family's story is featured in the book. Dr. Rafael Medoff is the founding director of the David S. Wyman Institute for Holocaust Studies. He's the author of more than 20 books about Jewish history, Zionism, and the Holocaust, including most recently, Whistleblowers. Ruth Landy is a communicator who worked for UNICEF and the World Health Organization on 5 continents, advocating for women and children. Now based in San Francisco, she harnesses her skills as an award-winning filmmaker and writer to tell her German Jewish family's story, seeking to preserve memory and inspire tolerance. Rafael and Ruth, we appreciate having both of you with us. It's now all yours, Rafael.
Thank you very much. I'm grateful to you, Howard, for organizing this program, making it possible for Ruth and me to share our thoughts with you today. And I also want to add my thanks to the Jewish Community Library, the Holocaust Center, and the other sponsors and organizers of today's program. In my remarks, I'd like to tell you all a little bit about this new book, Whistleblowers, Four Who Fought to Expose the Holocaust to America, and then to tell you a little bit about our overall approach to this nonfiction graphic novel. And then we'll have the honor of hearing from Ruth Landy, whose family is an important part of one of the chapters of this book that I'm about to describe. Whistleblowers, as you can see from the cover, focuses not on the Holocaust itself, not on the perpetrators or the victims, but rather on the bystanders, on how our country, America, responded to news of the Nazi genocide. But in this book, we focus not on the abandonment of the Jews, which was sadly the response by many in our government and the American public, but rather on a minority of individuals who did speak out, who did try to raise their voices in protest or to help the Jews during the Holocaust in various ways. I want to tell you a little bit about the 4 individuals who are featured in Whistleblowers, and I want to explain a little bit more about how the story of Arthur Weil, that Ruth Landy will be sharing with us in more detail shortly, how the story of Arthur Weil and the voyage of the refugee ship the St. Louis fit into our story arc, as it's referred to by comic book writers. I am not a comic book writer. I am a traditional historian, and the previous books I've written do not involve graphic illustrations. So this is, in a sense, a new approach. We all know about some of the more famous graphic novels dealing with historical subjects, especially the Holocaust, such as Maus, which was, of course, the pioneering work in using cartoon and comic book style illustration to talk about the Shoah. And there have been others since then. Whistleblowers is our contribution to this new and important field, giving teachers new tools with which to talk about what are frankly pretty difficult subjects. As an educator, my attitude in general is it doesn't really matter so much how you say it. It just matters that it gets said. So whether you are writing a book in the traditional format with text and footnotes, as I usually do, or telling history through a film or through art, or through comic book style storytelling, as long as you're getting the message across, that to me is the most important thing. It's the moral lessons that we can learn from these chapters in history that matter to me. And so if writing about these things in a comic book style can accomplish that goal, then I say let's do it. And that's what we've tried to do with this new book, Whistleblowers, Four Who Fought to Expose the Holocaust to America. Let me tell you very briefly about the individuals featured in this book. I want to begin with someone who is very familiar to those of you who are based in California, because he was an important part of political history, of California's political history for many years, and that is Alan Cranston, the late U.S. Senator, and in 1984 candidate for the Democratic presidential nomination. Cranston is in a book about America responding to the Holocaust because, believe it or not, he undertook a campaign to expose the truth about Hitler and Nazism to the American public. His story revolves around a very real, remarkable episode in the 1930s when Cranston, as a young journalist, discovered that there was an English language edition of Mein Kampf, Hitler's infamous manifesto of militarism, anti-Semitism, and racism, an English language edition that was being marketed in the United States with all of the harshest, most violent passages removed. It was a sanitized version of Hitler's book, trying to sell Nazism to the American public. Cranston then created his own pirate edition of Mein Kampf, reinserting all of the passages that had been deleted in a remarkable attempt to expose the truth about Hitler to Americans in the 1930s. What happened next is that Cranston got sued by Hitler. It was a copyright violation case. I mean, normally you can't just take someone else's book, even Adolf Hitler's book, and change it around and then market it on your own, even if you're only selling it for a dime, as Cranston did. I won't tell you more about the story because I don't want to give away any spoilers here, except to say that it's a remarkable, I know I'm using that word a lot, it's an astounding story of a real life courtroom battle in New York City in 1939 between Alan Cranston and Adolf Hitler's publishers acting on behalf of Hitler. But Cranston was arguably trying to blow the whistle, and that's why we brought him into a book about whistleblowers. Obviously, this is not the conventional kind of whistleblower, someone exposing corruption in government or in industry. But it was a kind of a moral whistleblower, trying to blow the whistle on the reality and the danger that Hitler posed to the free world. A second whistleblower featured in our book is actually not an American. There's one of the important figures featured in the book was a young Polish Catholic named Jan Karski. He was a member of the Polish underground. He was smuggled into the Warsaw Ghetto in the middle of the Holocaust in order to eyewitness atrocities against the Jews, and then from there taken to a Nazi concentration camp. So again, he could see firsthand what the Nazis were doing. Risking torture and worse, Karski was then smuggled by the Polish underground out of Europe and brought to the United States for a face-to-face meeting with President Franklin D. Roosevelt. The story of Karski's meeting with FDR, our president's response to him, and the great drama and adventure of Karski risking his life to blow the whistle on the Nazi genocide comprises one of the chapters in Whistleblowers. There's an additional chapter featuring two other individuals, one of whom I'm sure many of you have heard of, and now I'm going to show how this all links into the remarkable story of the Landy's grandfather, Arthur Weil, and the voyage of the St. Louis on which he was a passenger. So this other chapter focuses on a U.S. government official, an attorney in the Treasury Department by the name of Josiah Du Bois. Du Bois, by accident, came across information indicating that the State Department, again, he was in the Treasury Department. He was working under Secretary of the Treasury Henry Morgenthau Jr., the only Jewish member of FDR's cabinet. Du Bois came across information that the State Department was suppressing news about the mass murder of the Jews, and that the State Department officials were actually obstructing opportunities to rescue Jews from the Holocaust. It was Du Bois who convinced Morgenthau that they had to blow the whistle on their own colleagues in the State Department, risking their own professions, their own positions, in order to expose the horrors of what the Nazis were doing and how our own State Department was trying to suppress information about it. Now, Morgenthau is a very interesting figure in this story, in Whistleblowers, as you'll see. FDR had a number of Jewish advisors and this one member of his cabinet, but in general, they did not speak to the president about Jewish concerns. So during the years that we're discussing, the 30s and the 40s, when the persecution of Jews in Germany and elsewhere in Europe was intensifying, Roosevelt's Jewish aides, including Secretary Morgenthau, held back. They did not ask the president to intercede. They felt it wasn't their place to talk about Jewish concerns. They were worried people would point an accusing finger at them and allege that they cared more about their fellow Jews than about America's interests. But Morgenthau, as you'll see in Whistleblowers, in the chapter about the St. Louis, you'll see that Morgenthau tried behind the scenes during the crisis over the refugee ship, tried to come up with a way to grant them haven. Obviously, he failed. This is a story that Ruth will be telling us more about in a moment, but we know the ending of this tragic story, how the St. Louis was turned away from America, despite Morgenthau's efforts. So how does the St. Louis then tie into the saga of the Whistleblowers? Well, Morgenthau later, as you'll read, did rise to the occasion. Unlike the other Jewish members of President Roosevelt's inner circle, Morgenthau belatedly mustered the wherewithal to confront the president and to press him to do something about the Holocaust before it was too late. As a historian, I am persuaded that Morgenthau's attempt, but failure, to rescue the Jews of the St. Louis in 1939 haunted him and helped propel him 4 years later to finally speak out. And so the story of the St. Louis and of Arthur Weil is in many ways what we might call a prequel to the later chapter in Whistleblowers, where Morgenthau finally does rise to the occasion. I consider it a great honor that Ruth and her family approached my colleagues and me at the Wyman Institute to tell the story of Arthur Weil, to talk about what he experienced, but through this unique medium of comic book illustration. We didn't have to do it that way. I could have written, an ordinary book about the St. Louis. We could have taken this extraordinary document, Arthur Weil's previously unknown diary, could have simply published the diary. But the Landy family were convinced that the story was too important to just simply become another book, but rather it should be told in a dramatic and impactful way so it would reach much larger audiences than through conventional media. And so the family shared with us the Arthur Weil's actual diary. I want to very quickly show you a page from the diary just to give you a glimpse of what we're talking about here. Let me emphasize that until the Landys came forward, there was only one known existing diary of a St. Louis survivor. So Arthur Weil's diary is the second such precious document. This is a typed up version. Arthur survived the voyage. He was one of the lucky few, and he subsequently then took what he had written by hand aboard the ship, and he typed it up. As you can see, it's in German, so it had to be translated. And when I was composing the script for Whistleblowers and trying to figure what would be the most effective and honest way, the most authentic way to tell Arthur Weil's story, I thought it should really be taught through his words, not mine. And so I want to show you just one last image. This is one of the finished pages from the St. Louis story in Whistleblowers, because I want to explain something unique we did here. Instead of simply showing an ordinary, in comic book form, you would have just word balloons and a narrator's captions. Instead of that, almost the entire story is told through Arthur's actual words. On this page, you see we make the transition from me as the narrator, and that's the yellow box at the top in the first panel. Those are my words. And then after that, all of the rest of the narration in the blue boxes, these are actual excerpts from Arthur's diary. So when you read Whistleblowers, when you read the chapter, The Voyage of the Doomed, about Arthur Weil and the St. Louis, you are reading it, you're seeing the story through his eyes, through the eyes of someone who was actually on board, who suffered along with the other passengers, who had their hopes dashed. And it's not just a bunch of historians years later talking about it, but you are actually right there in 1939 with Arthur Weil. With that, it is now my honor to turn to Ruth Landy to hear a more personal perspective about what has meant to her family to share in the terrible but important legacy of the St. Louis, and to know firsthand of Arthur Weil's unique experiences aboard the ship.
Thank you, Rafael. And thank you. Here, just a second here. I'm going back to I'm going to show you the story visually. And thank you everybody for joining us. I know it's a Sunday afternoon. I'm grateful to share our story about the family's voyage on the St. Louis. And of course, I have to start with thank yous. First, a thank you to Howard Friedman. He has shown an extraordinary commitment to Jewish storytelling in all its forms, and that's a gift to all of us. And thank you, of course, to Dr. Rafael Medoff, because you've made a great contribution to Holocaust studies, and you took a chance with Whistleblowers to go in a new graphic direction, and we're very grateful that our great uncle's story is included in that. So Voyage of the Doomed, as Rafael has told you, is a story of a man, of a family, of an ocean liner, and of a disgraceful chapter, really, in Jewish history. So the St. Louis was a German transatlantic liner. Its most famous journey took place in May and June of 1939. The ship was carrying 935 passengers bound for Havana, Cuba, and almost all of them were Jews fleeing persecution in Nazi Germany. You know, in 1939, the situation in Nazi Germany was extremely severe for German Jews, so people were trying desperately to get out. The saga of the St. Louis was front page news at the time, but it's remained incredibly popular and a saga that is still a source of fascination today. It's been covered in articles and documentaries and even in a Hollywood movie. And the version that Dr. Rafael Medoff has brought to life is the first to appear in graphic form, actually. So I've always been fascinated by the connection between history, our family history with a small h, and history with a big H. This is the only picture we actually have of our family members on that ocean voyage. And that's Arthur Weil, the writer of the diary, standing in the back, in the middle, with the shock of black, with the dark hair. He was our Uncle Arthur as we were growing up. He was kind, he was gentle, he was understated. We used to visit him when we were children, when we went through Chicago on our way to seeing our family in California. And next to him, looking anxious and clutching her handbag, is his sister Erna, who was our precious grandmother. She was in a very difficult chapter. She had just lost her husband in Germany, our grandfather, a few months earlier, and she was separated from both of her children. So, of course, our story starts in Germany. Our family were middle-class Reform Jews from the Palatinate, which is a wine-growing region in southwest Germany that's near Alsace, France. And we can trace our family roots in the Palatinate back to the early 18th century. On the left there, you see the beautiful synagogue that was built in the late 19th century in the town of Landau. That's where our family worshiped. Our grandfather was a Jewish wine merchant in Landau in the 1920s and the 1930s. Arthur Weil was born in 1897 in a large and a loving family in the small town of Lustad near the Rhine River. And his father was a cattle trader. It was a popular profession for Jews living in the countryside at that time, at the beginning of the 20th century. And at the age of 18, Arthur was drafted into the German army, and he served with the army until the end of World War I. And it has to be said that our family was a patriotic German Jewish family, deeply loyal to the homeland. That's Arthur there in the left-hand picture, looking serious and concerned on the right. After World War I, Arthur married and settled in Heidelberg. He became a father, and he earned a living as a businessman working in his father-in-law's successful tobacco business. As you know, everything changed for the Jews of Germany after Hitler came to power in January of 1933. And within 6 months, Germany had transitioned from a parliamentary democracy to a one-party dictatorship. And our family businesses, whether it was tobacco, wine, cattle trading, all the businesses were the subject of economic boycotts, and they lost customers. And Arthur also lived through a painful chapter when his wife died suddenly in 1936. He raised his daughter alone and then remarried in 1939. And as you also know, by 1939, daily life became increasingly precarious for Germany's Jews. So now we're entering Whistleblowers' graphic version of our family story. 1938, as you also know, was a fateful year for German Jews. On Kristallnacht, November 9th, we just celebrated the anniversary of that recently. It was a night of terror when Jewish homes and businesses were vandalized and synagogues were burnt down across the country, including the one that our family worshiped in. That night, Kristallnacht, the Gestapo came to Arthur's apartment and home office. They threw out all their files and a desk out of the window, and they panicked the family. And the next day, Arthur and his brother Julius were picked up by the police while they were walking in the street, and they were arrested and sent to the Dachau concentration camp. Conditions, as you can imagine, were very rough. The guards released them, the camp released them, but only if they left Germany within 2 weeks. And the guard said to Arthur, "If you ever come back, we will kill you and your family." Desperate to get out of Germany, Arthur, Julius, and their families buy tickets on the St. Louis liner, and our widowed grandmother, Erna, accompanies them. They paid for visas, allowing them to disembark in Havana while they were waiting for their US visas to be issued. Their sister City and her husband Ludwig were already in Cuba because they'd taken an earlier liner that arrived safely. And our youthful father, Ernest, and our Aunt Sue also had fled Germany, and they were waiting for their mother, our grandmother, in Buffalo, New York. So it was as if everything was in place for this nightmare to be resolved for all of them in the new world. So the ship is on its way, and after leaving the Bay of Biscay, it starts its transatlantic journey. And at the beginning, Arthur writes in his diary that the ship is more luxurious than they expected, that they're served very good food, and that they're pleasantly surprised by the respectful way, actually, that they're treated by the German crew under the command of Captain Gustav Schroeder. And every day, Arthur turns to his diary and he records the daily events. At last, land is in sight, and the St. Louis puts down anchor in Havana's harbor. Great excitement prevails on the ship, Arthur writes. Everybody is full of expectation as the landing formalities are put into place. The St. Louis passengers remain on the ship in the harbor, and small boats carrying relatives approach the liner. Finally, we spotted City and Ludwig through a porthole, Arthur writes. It's indescribable to see your loved ones after such a long separation. We long to be reunited with them soon. 4 days pass, and the St. Louis passengers have still not been allowed to disembark, and rumors start to circulate that something has gone wrong. The Cuban government did allow 28 of the passengers to disembark in Havana. One was actually a man who attempted suicide on the ship and was allowed to disembark and go to a local hospital. But the rest of the passengers, including our family, of course, learned that their landing documents had been invalidated by the Cuban government. It was a toxic mix of corruption, of power struggles, and hostility towards immigrants that spelled disaster for the passengers. And on June 2nd, Cuba's president orders the liner out of Cuban waters. Our ship is starting to move slowly, Arthur writes. Thousands are standing out there. Nobody is waving. You can feel the tears, and most of us cannot fight tears either. The mood is becoming desperate, Arthur writes on June 3rd. There is no doubt, he continues, we are returning to Europe. We are all terrified. No one wants to go back. Captain Schroeder steers his ship north towards Florida. He's still hoping there'll be a diplomatic solution that will enable the passengers to disembark in the US. And the US-based Jewish Joint Distribution Committee is leading those negotiations. Arthur and his fellow passengers sail so close to Miami, they can see the multicolored lights of the city's hotels and entertainment facilities. Some St. Louis passengers cable President Roosevelt and ask for refuge, but Roosevelt never responds. The press brings the story to millions of readers, but only a few journalists suggest that the refugees should be admitted. As you probably also know, US immigration laws at that time severely limited the number of immigrants allowed into the US. And by 1939, the visa waiting list for German Jews was several years. This was, despite many pleas, Roosevelt refuses to issue an executive order admitting the St. Louis refugees. And sadly, this was a propaganda coup for Hitler, proving that no one wanted to harbor the Jews. The mood is dark among the passengers, and Arthur writes, "The night is very hot and humid, and it's hard to get to sleep." And he continues, "Bad dreams about my experiences in the Dachau concentration camp are tormenting me through the night." What you're seeing here is a cable sent from the St. Louis out in the middle of the Atlantic to our father, Ernest, who was in Buffalo. And it's a plea from his mother, Erna. And she writes in German, "We are well. If ship returns to Germany, greatest concern about Uncles Arthur and Julius. Please help, Mama." And you can see our father's handwriting. He transcribed this late in life. His handwriting is shaky because he was losing his sight. So the St. Louis does begin its journey back to Europe. But passengers learn eventually they won't return to Germany. The Jewish organizations have negotiated with 4 European governments. Great Britain, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France have all agreed to take in the St. Louis passengers. On the ship, there are stressful negotiations, matching the passengers with the countries willing to take them in. And Arthur wants to go to the Netherlands because that's where his parents had fled after their home was vandalized on Kristallnacht. But our father, Ernest, that's him on the left, he was deeply aware, very politically astute, even as a very young man. He was very aware of Hitler's militaristic ambitions, and he managed remotely through telegram to convince the family that England was their safest option. After 5.5 weeks at sea, we are on firm ground for the first time, Arthur writes in his final journal entry. Only gradually does it occur to us that we are finally saved in a free country where you don't have to be afraid of concentration camps. May all our co-religionists experience such a happy end as we did. Amen. Arthur's diary concludes. So after disembarking in Southampton, the family members were settled in a village near London, and our father managed, with a lot of hard work, to get a visa, a US visa for his mother, and she immigrated to New York on a ship in December 1939 with World War II already underway. And in June of 1940, Arthur and his family follow, and they settle in Chicago, close to other relatives. Our family were among the very lucky St. Louis passengers. Nearly half of the ship's refugees who were admitted to France, to Belgium, and the Netherlands were murdered in the Nazi death camps. So the Weil siblings remain close for the rest of their lives, and this is them sitting on a park bench in Geneva, Switzerland, visiting us when we were living there in 1972. And that's Arthur Weil in the middle with the glasses and the white hair. He and his second wife, Anneliese, built a new life in Chicago, but the scars of the Holocaust never really went away. Arthur refused to go back into business. He was haunted really by the fear that his life's work could be ripped away again, and instead he took a low-paying job as a shipping clerk. Our grandmother Erna, in the blue blouse and the glasses, followed her sister Sue to San Francisco in the late 1940s and never remarried. She was precious to us as her grandchildren, and we still enjoy her German Jewish cooking traditions passed down to us. That was the one part of our heritage that really survived and is with us still in the 21st century. So in conclusion, It's been 85 years since the saga of the St. Louis liner, but its themes could not be more current today. On the right, you see Sarah. She's a young Iraqi refugee arriving in Greece after a dangerous boat journey in 2015. And there are many Sarahs, as we know, in the world today, seeking safe havens in Western Europe or the United States. On November 5th of this year, Donald Trump was elected to a second term as President of the United States. And he rode to victory in part by painting immigrants as a menace, quote, poisoning the blood of our country. You can imagine that anyone with our background, that language is chilling. We hope that this graphic version of our Jewish family's flight from persecution will introduce a younger generation to this story, and that it will stimulate compassion and action on a hot button topic which still divides our world today. Thank you very much. I'm glad to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Ruth, and thank you so much, Rafael. So if folks have questions for either of our speakers, you can put them in the chat, and then I will communicate them. And I will begin with a question for Rafael from Roz and Michael Shorenstein, who ask, what is the target age for readers of this graphic book?
Whistleblowers is not a children's book. I want to emphasize that it is written at an adult level. I anticipate, and I've already heard from teachers and other educators, that it will be used for used in the college level and also upper high school grades. I tried to write it in such a way that it would be interesting to all ages from, let's say, middle teens. Even younger children could, I think, read it with profit, but not having any background would make it a little tougher. Still, I kept in mind, as I composed the script, that I wanted to appeal to as a broad an audience as possible. But again, although we hope that it will be used in schools as widely as possible and universities, it is not a book for children. Let me just add one more thought here. In creating a nonfiction story, a historically accurate portrayal of events during the Holocaust, the artist Dean Motter and I had to confront the question of how explicit to be about the atrocities that figure into the storylines. On the one hand, we wanted to be authentic. We're writing about the Holocaust and we're not going to paper over it. On the other hand, we didn't want there to be scenes that were so brutal as to make the book unsuitable, for example, for some ages, or unsettling really for anyone. So as you will see in Whistleblowers, there are some scenes where there are allusions to violent episodes, but they are done in a somewhat restrained manner. So you understand what's happening, but it's not shoved in your face in a gory way that would be, personally discomforting. It was a tricky balance. It wasn't like when writing an ordinary a book about the Holocaust, you're describing things. It's just text on paper. It's not the same as looking at a victim or a perpetrator. Here, I was working with an artist, an award-winning comic book artist, who was going to try to bring some of those scenes to life, and so it was something of a task to be sensitive to both desires, to be authentic as historians, but at the same time to do it in a way that would be somewhat tasteful, so that everyone would feel comfortable and not want to put the book down in the middle. And I hope we achieve that aim.
Great, thank you so much. And this is a question from Don Shapiro for Ruth. He asks, did you ever visit the areas of Germany where your family flourished before the Shoah?
Funny you should ask that. For decades, I did not want to go back. I felt, and I do want to add that the Siegel family, Sue Siegel, our aunt, is the reason we are all in San Francisco. And the Siegels also contributed, Hannah Shapira, other relatives to the help to bring that chapter to life. So for many years, I did not want to go back to Germany. We never spoke German. We never visited Germany, even though we grew up in Europe. But I did return last year and then again this October. And basically, I produced a book that's only privately available here, but is publicly published in Germany about our family story and our family recipes. And we did hold a ceremony in October where we laid Stolperstein, who are the stumbling stones, in the pavement in front of the last home of Mina and Jacob Weil. It was, thank God the family did not go to the Netherlands, because Arthur and our grandmother's mother, Mina Weil, was deported from Amsterdam, like Anne Frank, to Westerbork, and she was murdered in Auschwitz. We only discovered that a couple of years ago, where she died. So we have now laid these remembrance plaques symbolically bringing Mina home in that small town of Lustad. They're the first in the town. And I spoke to 200 people about the winemaking, the Jewish contribution to the winemaking of the Palatinate, because our story resonated, and Germans are actually dealing with their past in a ways that this country is not. So that's an answer to say, yes, I have gone back, and yes, our family went back. I was accompanied by my brothers and cousins, and it feels like at least we have symbolically returned our great-grandparents from the horrible place where they died to their home. And that is part of historical healing, which I think is necessary and helpful for all of us to pursue as best we can.
Thank you very much. So Rabbi Moshe Levin asks, it's a charged question, how do we deal with Trump's architect of his immigration policy, a Jewish grandson of Holocaust survivors, Stephen Miller? Can we speak out? Our leaders trying to reach him? I actually don't know that Stephen Miller is a grandson of Holocaust survivors, but I'm not sure of that. But if either of you do want to address the question.
Dr. Medoff, do you want to say anything?
I certainly understand why the issue of immigration is a sensitive one for many of us in the Jewish community. As a historian, I should note that there are some significant differences between what Jewish refugees were experiencing in the 1930s, let's say at the time of the St. Louis, and the immigration debate today. Without getting into too much of the specifics because of our time limitations, the Jews who were fleeing from Nazi Germany were being persecuted because of their race and religion. So they were refugees from persecution. Now, American immigration law in those days did not recognize the concept of asylum. There was no category to grant asylum for victims of persecution. Today we have that. The Jews fleeing Germany did not enter America illegally. They didn't. They tried to come lawfully. They were largely excluded. Prejudice was a major factor in their exclusion. So for many of the immigrants who were at the heart of the debate in today's public policy conversations, they're obviously coming from different circumstances. I'm sure there are some among them who are victims of persecution, but obviously many are economic refugees or are fleeing different kinds of hardships in their home countries that are not persecution. So it's a more complicated situation today. Those who are victims of persecution can and are admitted, granted political asylum, whereas the question of what to do about illegal immigrants who are not fleeing persecution is rather different. So while it's true that everything can be lumped in one category as the immigration issue, from my perspective as a historian, these are two pretty different situations. That doesn't mean I'm recommending that anyone take this or that particular position. I'm merely pointing out that historical parallels are tricky. There often are things about contemporary issues that have parallels to the 30s and 40s, but there are many aspects of today's world that are different. So I don't like to rush into analogies between then and now if they don't very clearly apply. It's a complicated issue, and I imagine America will be wrestling with this issue long after the next presidency.
Thank you. Ruth, did you want to say anything or?
I would just say that it's all of us are perhaps still digesting the impact of the results of this election, of the complete control of the government and really the Supreme Court by one party. I certainly carry in my own genes, if you wish, our family's experience are going through that period when a democracy became a dictatorship. And I think I'm not suggesting that will happen here, but that we all need to be very conscious, very active and thoughtful about how we respond. And later this afternoon, I will participate in a Zoom call with some folks from my neighborhood who are writing postcards, getting people to vote to see how all of us respond collectively to whatever lies ahead as citizens of a democracy. And I hope everyone else will, on this call, will think about how to best use your sensibilities, your skills, your perspective to be active citizens in the time ahead.
Thank you. Rafael, Ross and Michael Shorenstein note that I won't go into details, but there's a lot of controversies in California around the implementation of an ethnic studies requirement in our schools. And they're wondering whether you will be planning to market this book to schools for upper level high school history classes.
Well, our publisher, Dark Horse Yo Books, is actively seeking to have the book adopted by school districts around the country. Because in most states today, Holocaust and genocide education is a required part of the curriculum. So that poses a challenge to high school teachers every year to come up with interesting and engaging ways to talk about this subject. The average 15 or 16-year-old in America today naturally looks at events in Germany in the 1930s as very distant and unrelatable. So it's a unique challenge that teachers face. They have to talk about the Holocaust and other genocides, and they want to, and they should. But it's not always enough to simply have your students read the Diary of Anne Frank. The Diary of Anne Frank is obviously a very powerful teaching tool, but it's only one part of the story. And that's where we hope that a book like Whistleblowers can help provide teachers with an important educational weapon. So I look forward to it reaching students at potentially the middle school level also, but certainly high school and into the college years. The responses that we've had so far from teachers and other educators have been very positive. Whistleblowers comes with a free teacher's guide, crafted classroom lessons and questions for discussion with students. So it's something that we're already finding that teachers consider to be very valuable and useful, and we hope that will continue to be the case. Certainly, anyone on this call who has connections with local schools, whether public or parochial, it would be great if you could recommend to your teacher or principal that they consider incorporating Whistleblowers into their curriculum.
Thank you. If I could maybe just continue with if folks, this is the sort of their last opportunity to contribute a question. So I'll meanwhile, ask, I think, one of my own for Rafael. When you're talking about the story of, in the book, a story I didn't know about, Josiah Du Bois, which you mentioned in the beginning, I thought of the Holocaust Studies institution that you direct was named after the historian David Wyman, whose book, The Abandonment of the Jews, really, certainly for me, and I think for a lot of Americans, opened our eyes to the inaction on the part of the US government on behalf of European Jews. And I'm wondering, especially, I think it's been around 40 years since the book was published, what are some of the, not just, I mean, this is a big topic, obviously, but in terms of what you think, how we should be looking at that period in terms of our government, and what have you learned in this last period since the publication that you think Americans should really absorb about how our government behaved during that time?
Professor Wyman's best-selling book, The Abandonment of the Jews, remains the definitive study of America's response to the Holocaust, even after all these years. It's been 40 years. This month actually marks the 40th anniversary of the publication of The Abandonment of the Jews. It is still the gold standard in our field. However, Professor Wyman was followed by a generation of younger scholars who have carried on his research, and that was the purpose of the decision to establish the David Wyman Institute for Holocaust Studies, to continue research into aspects of America's response to the Holocaust. Professor Wyman never looked at the abandonment of the Jews, as important as it was, as the final word on the subject. On the contrary, more research has been done in recent years on different aspects of the American response to the Holocaust, including important studies of American news media coverage. There's a book called Buried by the Times by Professor Laurel Leff, which tells the whole full story of how the New York Times covered or failed to cover the Holocaust. There's been a very important study of the academic community called The Third Reich in the Ivory Tower by Professor Stephen S. Norwood, which looks at how Harvard, Yale, Columbia, and other Ivy League institutions built friendly relations with the Nazis during the 1930s. I myself have written a number of books revealing new information about President Roosevelt's response to the Holocaust, including information about his motives in choosing to refrain from helping Jews during the Nazi genocide years. So yes, a lot of additional research has been done. There's more to be done. Sadly, all the new research tends to point in the same direction. In other words, the more we learn about, let's say, the President Roosevelt's response, the worse it gets, in a sense. That we learn even more about the trends that Professor Wyman pointed to in his earlier work. The more we learn about American media coverage of the Holocaust, as in Professor Leff's book about the New York Times, the more we realize that important media outlets knew about the Nazi mass murder and yet minimized it or buried it in the back pages. And that's true, unfortunately, of a lot of other American cultural institutions. So it's a disturbing story. In a sense, it's become even more troubling as additional research has been done in recent years. But I would argue that it's more necessary than ever before. Because ultimately, what's the purpose of studying the 30s and 40s? For me, as a historian and as a human being, the purpose of studying that era is to learn moral lessons which we can apply to today so that our generation and future generations will not make the same mistakes in those days, so that our leaders and our future leaders will not turn a blind eye when innocent people are being persecuted or desperately seeking refuge. So as personally uncomfortable as it is to read about that era, from my point of view, it's more necessary than ever before. Every generation of Americans faces the same kinds of issues. Should we care when people are being persecuted in other countries? Should we intervene? What is America's moral responsibility? These are critical questions, and they need to be discussed even at the level of teenagers in high school. And that's why a book like Whistleblowers, Four Who Fought to Expose the Holocaust to America, is, in my view, so important, because we want to get young people talking about these issues now, before they become voters, before they become leaders, before they become the, the elected officials who will make policy and guide the next generation.
Thank you so much for that eloquent response. This will be our last question, which is note that Amazon mentions that Whistleblowers is part of a series of books. What are the other books in this series?
Well, I have in recent years worked on several somewhat related books. Again, going into the world of using comic books, cartoons, animation, political cartoons to talk about these subjects. So these are kind of novel ways of approaching Holocaust education. My most recent book after Whistleblowers is called Cartoonists Against Racism, The Secret Jewish War on Bigotry. You'll find it on Amazon. It's about an episode in the 1940s and 50s when American Jewish organizations quietly hired prominent American comic book artists and political cartoonists to create anti-racism educational materials to be distributed in schools, unions, and the news media in order to try to promote tolerance and racial harmony in the United States at a very tumultuous time.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, Rafael, both for being with us today, but also for all the work that went behind this. And this is a great book and a really welcome addition to history and Holocaust studies. Thanks everybody for joining us, and thanks to the Holocaust Center and to New Lair House. We will send an email message to everybody tomorrow in the afternoon with more information on purchasing the book, and as well as some of our library materials that can provide background on the stories that are featured in the book. Is there anything that you would like to add, Rafael?
Yes, if anyone had a question that for me or for Ruth, and there wasn't time for it to be asked, please feel free to contact me through my website, wymaninstitute.org, WYMAN Institute.org, and I'll be glad to answer any questions or to, of course, to pass on to Ruth any questions you have for her or her family.
Thank you so much. And Ruth, do you want to leave us with anything?
I would just say that thank you so much for this opportunity. I was not necessarily equating all immigrants with refugees. What I was talking about is the demonization of the other that was characteristic of the 1930s, and that we are in a dangerous chapter now also of demonizing the other in the form of immigrants or others. And it is our Jewish tradition, I think, to consider tolerance and the welcoming, at least the considering of the stranger as part of our core values. And that I hope we will all take this on in our own way in the difficult time and chapter that lies ahead. And grateful to you, Howard, and to Rafael for this opportunity.
Amen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ruth. Take
Thanks.
care.
Thanks to all of you. Goodbye.
Take care. Bye-bye.